I'm holding off.
Okay.
Okay, now I can go. So what I'm going to present is largely extracted from my contributions to the Grand Piano #5, which was published in 2007, 15 plus years ago, in what we might call the before time, before the MAGA turn and its accompanying white supremacist fascism, before the COVID pandemic and its large-scale psychosocial effects, before climate change shifted from being a term to becoming a devastating reality. It's hard to say if 2007 was a happier or better time, or if all its authors felt more optimistic then than now. Certainly, I am no longer so optimistic about the human future. Though I thought there were readily apparent grounds for being so back in the years, 1975 to 1980, that the Grand Piano Project undertook to think about, to remember. The title of my Grand Piano 5 essay was An Unlikelihood, a reference both to a motif that appears several times in the essay and to the larger unlikelihood of the very convergence of writers in whose context and through whose unsettling as well as inspiring influence the events and ideas and theories and socio-aesthetic inventions and political intentions reflected and or articulated in the Grand Piano and in hundreds of language writings, books of poetry, and or critical thought and cultural theory have come into being. The essay and my presentation today begin by quoting the opening words of Charles Montague Doty's Travels in Arabia Deserta, which end with a question purportedly posed to Doty by a friend: how couldst thou take such journeys into the fanatic Arabia? How indeed? The question reflects an egregious but prevalent attitude typical of the British colonialist imagination of the 19th century and before. Charles Doty was a Victorian English poet, travel writer, and explorer. Travels in Arabia Deserta was written after many years living with a Bedouin. It was first published in 1888. Doty's writing style is remarkable for its semantic convolutions and verbal turns. Some have claimed that he aspired to imitate the style of the King James Bible. Others that he writes Arabic and English. The writer Laura Riding Jackson and her husband Schuyler Jackson devoted extensive sections of their book Rational Meaning, A New Foundation for the Definition of Words and Supplementary Essays to examining and praising Doty's meticulous attention to language for its own sake. In my Grand Piano 5 essay, my intention in evoking Travels in Arabia Deserta was not to praise its prose, though I do find that astonishing, but with a rhetorical flourish borrowed from it and the unsettling phrase fanatic Arabia to bring into the foreground a perhaps sharp metaphor for language writing in 1975 to 1980, or rather for the terrain into which it journeys. And it's with this goal that I begin with it again today. I'll also add that at one point I've inserted into the Grand Piano 5 essay, as I'm going to read it today, a bit from a new work in progress of mine. I'll also shift briefly to Grand Piano 1, and very near the end, I'll read a few lines from Writing is an Aid to Memory, lines that I quote in Grand Piano 3. Also interpolated into the essay at various points, and I hope they'll be obvious, are lines from Celia and Louis Zukowski's A24. The verbal lines are from various of Louis Zukowski's works, but they were chosen by Celia Zukowski for A24, where they are accompanied by Handel's pieces for the clavier. After some 6 months or more of rehearsals, and very soon after Louis Zukowski's death, and with Celia Zukowski's blessings, A24 was performed several times in the Bay Area in 1978. It is a polyphonic work with 6 elements in play: poetry, voiced by Barrett Watton; drama, voiced by Steve Benson and Carla Harryman; Thought, voiced by Kit Robinson, Story, which I voiced, and The Handle, which Bob Perlman played on piano rather than harpsichord, setting the tempo and establishing the upper limit to speech. And so I'll begin here, or make a transition with a line from A24. I, dust, raise the great hem of the extended world that nothing can leave. A new voice hailed me of an old friend, not in that long street of Damascus, which is called Straight, which is where Charles Doty encountered it, according to the intricate first sentence of his travels in Arabia Deserta, but in the convoluted pathways of my generally populous mind, in a tone that could be heard as outraged or solicitous or simply curious. The voice that hailed Doty goes on to ask, how couldst thou take such journeys into the fanatic Arabia? Steak, mother, steak, steak. I could eat 3 pounds of steak all by myself. Experience, expanded by thought and extended by language, was to be played out in a context of contradictory emotions. It established a paradigm, a context for further multiple heterogeneous contexts. Perhaps it was there that my obsession with time began. With simultaneities embedded in coexisting narratives, each bearing numerous histories. Everything has density. Everything seems doubtful. I want then to say something about community and the techne dialectike, the art of thinking things through toward unfolding future understandings via retrospection's inner speech, one's most intimate encounters with interiorized others. Or maybe it's less an art than a necessity, an encounter forced on one by chance. One wants to grab one's chance. Hail sail, hail sailing, everywhere with energy. Yes, sir. I remember Barry saying recently that he'd like to eliminate like from the poetic lexicon. No more similes. I found myself of late avoiding them as much as possible, but maybe he meant that there should be no more misuse of like for as. As is a far more dynamically nuanced and polyvalent word. My love is as a red, red rose. My love's not a mere semblance or similitude of a flower fixed in the imagination, but is itself efflorescing, blooming, sweetening, blushing. I slept as a log. Carla, as I remember her, sitting in the sun on our front steps during a break in an A24 rehearsal in the summer of 1978. She is saying something about lack of lineage, about necessity and self-invention. And I had to think about it later. Changes of context for one's thinking occur continually. They change as one's thinking. I am in your dreams, my confidant. Out of debate comes perplexity, a crucial element in the game of ideas, which takes a lot of time to play and more than one player. Interactions with others are essential for those who thrive on perplexity. The ever-social Socrates is a case in point. Socrates, that lover of perplexities, as Hannah Arendt calls him. Remembering is rarely innocent. On reflection, one will always find awaiting one, as it were, the feeling, whether vague or accompanied by certainty, that one has been or is at fault, inadequate, or wrong. This is a fundamental part of human experience and a key element in the social bonds out of which individual as well as collective identities are woven. In thinking, one discovers one's doubt, and the experience of doubting provokes one to think. And this activity, which is such an intensely solitary activity, is also deeply social. One thinks in ways one has learned from others by standards more demanding than one could have imagined on one's own, and with information gleaned from outside sources. And one does so out of self-respect and to earn one's place in one's community. But isn't it the case that doubt exacerbates one's solitariness, even at times one's loneliness, and thus may weaken one's bonds with one's community, even when it is the real or imaginary judgment of that very community that has thrown one into doubt? One has a choice available to one at this juncture to doubt oneself farther away from the community, or to think oneself back into it, not, let's hope, by persuading oneself that community is right, not by subsuming one's judgments to those of the community, not by giving up one's power or one's freedom, but by exercising one's ability and right precisely to doubt. This is what Foucault calls, quote, the critical work that thought brings to bear on itself, end quote, in its effort, quote, to think differently through the practice of a knowledge that is foreign to it, end quote. Doubting begins precisely there, not as a Cartesian point of departure, but as a way of venturing into the midst of things. Skepticism, doubt, it can prove liberating. Skepticism, says the model, will keep you free, but it can lead to a sense of hopelessness, impossibility. It can seem to promise nothing but dead ends and fatigue. Skepticism will exhaust you. Ergo, says the logician, freedom is exhausting. Voice, a voice blown, returning as may. My father was conflict averse. He didn't attempt to drag his father anywhere. He simply went into the orchard on his own and then went on quite a bit farther, way beyond the tree. But first, from his parents' house in Oakland, on December 4, 1933, he wrote to Gertrude Stein. My dear Gertrude Stein, he begins. He tells her he has read the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas and praises her for having, quote, given a true picture of the artistic and literary life of Paris, end quote, which he had not yet visited ever, though he moved there for a period 2 years later. Having finished the autobiography, he tells her, quote, I wanted to read something else of yours, and I naturally turned to Three Lives. And I realized that it is the first modern novel. Although many people object to the manner in which you repeat yourself, I do not find this annoying, end quote. As he saw it, quoting again, the good Anna is typical of hundreds of women who spend their entire lives in serving and aiding others and getting little out of life themselves and never receiving any of the good things themselves in the scape of their lives. The scape of their lives is extremely limited, end quote. He ends by telling her that, quote, I myself am learning to write. I am working on a novel now, and you have done so much for me in aiding me to form a style of my own. You have done this for hundreds of other writers, whether they realize it or not. For after one has read something of yours, he can never be exactly the same again, end quote. My father had just turned 18 years old. Oh, Head, think how climbing you would be. Are there rules governing the sentiments? The sentiments are subject to forces, social and psychological, physiological, and circumstantial, but forces are not the same thing as rules. Sentiments can't be ruled either in or out of existence, or can they? In the 1980s, characterizations of the language project as dictatorial, intransigent, cold, contentious, and cliquish were occasionally persuasive to many. They encouraged people to negate what we were doing, to hate it. I saw myself, meanwhile, as having been energetically engaged in affirmation, I believed in language writing and the community in which it was meaningful. I loved being a part of it. Loved? Yes, I was coming face to face with obsessing disunity and suffering repeated dishevelment. What there was to be a part of was difficulty, exercising the power of disturbance, turning love out. Language bashing, as it erupted in the pages of Poetry Flash in 1979, was intended to justify broad-scale ignoring and ignorance of work done under its rubric, that is language writing's rubric, and to turn even people with a predilection for it against it. The general message was that the whole project was hateful, but we were undertaking it for love. And now I hear the title of Robert Freely's For Love, echoing back from that sentence as from the face of an insurmountable cliff. Opening my tattered copy of For Love at random, I come upon the poem, The Names. Creeley imagines a gathering, quote, 2, 3, 4, all 5, end quote, on the broken seat, and writes, oh, glad to see, oh, glad to be, where company is so derived from sticks and stones, bottles and bones. Zora Neale Hurston's autobiography, Dust Tracks on the Road, was awaiting publication at Lippincotts when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. With the US's entry into World War II, Bertram Lippincott determined that the book needed editing, and he withheld from print parts that might be deemed unpatriotic or that mitigated against the heroic figure that Lippincott thought Hurston, as a representative Black American woman, should play. Among the deletions were 2 chapters, quote, Seeing the World as It Is, which chastised Americans and Christians for the hypocrisy of their portrayal of themselves as just and kind, and was scathingly critical of American imperialism, and the chapter, The Inside Light, being a salute to friendship. In a letter to Carl Van Vechten, Hurston said about the latter, quote, I wrote a chapter in my new book dedicated to friendship, but the publishers deleted it. In it, I tried to show my inside feelings for certain people because I am not sure that I ever have made it clear how I feel. I regretted the loss of that chapter, end quote. And to her friend Hamilton Holt on the same subject, she said, quote, now I look like a hog under an acorn tree, guzzling without ever looking up to see where the acorns came from. Once every year, this tree needs shining. Once every year, these leaves need dusting. Perhaps to eliminate like from the poetic lexicon would help liberate us from images in defiance of the image-producing image mongering that is capitalism's end of history. If so, then let like go. I want history, which is to say context, which is to say community, the social space for what W.E.B. Du Bois calls, quote, the 1,001 little actions which go to make up life. Wrong book. Doors are called joiners. There are several, but the term is who work. Commonly this pitch its second name, but you are the most beautiful and mostly linked. I'd like to end by proposing that the grand piano, an experiment in collaborative autobiography, is an autobiography, one of many possible autobiographies of language writing itself. And I would add that, since it has fallen to me to perform the last of the grand piano TV shows, the problem of an ending has also fallen to me. The best kind of ending for something that doesn't or that refuses to end is the cliffhanger. Language writing, I would propose, is a cliff. Hang on, there's much more excitement to come. Over to you, Carla.
Yay. Thank you. Okay, so what I will suggest is just to pause for a few seconds after that wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Lynn. And then entertain some questions. But count to 10 first.
Backwards.
Yeah. I think I'm at about 4 right now.
I've actually been struck by the degree to which, certainly not all, but some of these grand piano GPTV shows have touched on points of vulnerability, either like experienced vulnerability, like of the individuals participating in the social life, the social spaces of language writing back in the period that the books cover or talk about, but maybe also like language writing itself, its points of vulnerability, like intentional vulnerability. I mean, I touched on the ways in which language writing was attacked vociferously and repeatedly in the 1970s and since then, obviously. But anyway, a thought in passing while everybody slowly counts backwards from 10 to 0.
Thank you. That was a kind of wonderful derive of a coda of sorts. I'm going to go look at the questions. If Zeppi becomes too annoying, I will troubleshoot in one way or another. She was just barking in a minute ago. Mara Ann asks, could you speak to like as related to love in this context as well?
I'm not sure how much overlap. Well, there's obviously homonymic overlap between like as in I really like apples, or I really love apples, and like as in something is like something else, like similitude, unless possibly there's some notion that people tend to love things that are just like them, and possibly this plays out in some areas of human activity, human practice. But I think that the topic that I was harping on in my presentation was the importance of unlikeness, of encounters with the unlike and the unlikely, precisely because it unsettles where one thinks one has situated, where one feels, you know, to use the cliche, that with one's comfort zone. I suppose people feel comfortable when they're in situations like in familiar situations, like the situations that are like a lot of other situations. But whether those familiar situations are lovable or even capable of prompting creative erotics, that I'm not sure about.
So Tom has his hand up, and also I'm going to call on him, and then I encourage you to raise your hand via the reactions or literally, and I'm going to, there's 3 rooms, so I'm going to kind of cruise around and look for hands and look for the chat. But Tom, go ahead.
Well, just a quick first of all, that was a wonderful presentation. But just a quick comment that, of course, like in the sense of I like apples, and like in the sense of apples are like pears, are the same, just as when you did it yourself in the next sentence. You said you described something as being familiar. Familiar is a term that comes from family. Like is whether you're using it to say I feel akin to something, again, another of the same kinds of words. it really can't be expressed in a way that doesn't claim that it is something akin, something that is of oneself, or that oneself is of it somehow.
Of is an important, and of is also a metaphoric hinge of some sort. So here, Jean Hooveen has asked, are you aware that when reviews of Imagism first appeared, that people found it a hateful writing?
I wasn't aware of
This
that. That's,
with a capital I. So,
yeah, no, yeah, like HD and
yeah,
Ezra Pound and so forth. No, I was not aware that reviews of that were negative, but I'm not surprised, given that it was, again, you know, breaking a break in lyric poetry, or what people expect from the lyric.
yeah, that was sort of, I would thought to throw in an unlike difference into this conversation as a like. So Imagism is in fact problematic to language writing or image. I think it's interesting that the very movement that was called Imagist actually had the same kind of reaction. And you're right, people couldn't find the emotion that they wanted to find in the poems, so they found that it was hateful. So just
Yeah.
Thank you. Barrett has his hand up.
Okay, that's a good one. You know, when you were talking about likeness, and I suddenly was reminded of a title of a work by Robert Lowell, of all people to bring into this conversation, called Land of Unlikeness. And there was a particular way in which metaphor was a part of a cultural construction. I taught Matthew Arnold today. There's a book out called Arnold and God. I remember when I was working as an academic editor, I edited the book called Arnold and God. And metaphor was a significant aspect of his aesthetics. And I think when Lowell is percolating around, these theological issues, but also doing it from a Harvard perspective, this whole, there's a real force there around unlikeness and metaphoricity. And so, I'm thinking about the critique of the high, let's say, that the denial of metaphor actually, I think, is connected to. And if parataxis, we've all talked about parataxis endlessly until the cows come home. But the refusal of metaphoricity, I think, is really significant because it segues into this high-low distinction, and I think Lowell was also in his own way trying to kind of run out from under that, as the theologically informed writer that he was. So I guess I'm bringing this back, bringing back home to Boston in a way, or to Cambridge, and thinking a little bit about one of the genealogies of this refusal of likeness or metaphor. So over to you, Lyn. What do you think about that? I know you're working in allegory, but metaphor is a slightly different, set of issues, I think.
Yeah. I mean, metaphor has become so inescapable in language use. Probably it always was, or for a very long time. It's very hard to say much of anything without lapsing into metaphors, like lapsing into metaphors. Right there's a metaphor. It's something that in writing, I find myself trying to avoid metaphors in normal sentences, and I challenge them when I encounter them, especially in student writing. Although the wackiness of mixed metaphors, there's a lot to be said in favor of that. I'm not sure where to go with the Harvard context and the Lowell context of a rejection of metaphoricity or a compulsion to track metaphor. I mean, I wondered if part of what was informing Lowell's relationship to metaphor might derive from what I would speculate would be his competition for prominence with T.S. Eliot and Eliot's love of the metaphysical poets who tended to use metaphor like extravagantly and magnificently also. But that's
so there are like a gazillion questions, and I'm going to start, and I have no idea the order because there's two forms for making questions, and sometimes I actually, even when I navigate, I can't see the hand up. So but I'm wondering if Luke, Emmett, do you want to ask your question or shall I read it? If I don't hear from you, I'll just start reading. Read it. Okay, great. So, Lyn, you talk about skepticism as a means toward community and the complexities these embody. Do you aim at all to provide knowledge with your writing? And if so, are you relying on the authority as who has written it?
I certainly acknowledge, what, to use your term, Luke, I try to acknowledge authorities, that is like sources of thought or sources of thought which I might change or counter or simply steal, appropriate. I thought a lot about the relationship of poetry or, certain kinds of poetry to knowledge. I mean, who doesn't want knowledge? It seems like something that we are acculturated to pursue and hope to attain, which of course is where another point of vulnerability, because we can't ever attain all the knowledge that we want to have. But I think it's not my knowledge, to the extent that I have any, that I would want to communicate as a writer, but rather to provoke thought that can lead, inspire others to chase after or seek their own knowledge. I don't know, that seems like a little Pollyanna-ish response to that question. But I don't position myself as an authority. And sometimes I regret
it's the twining of authority with knowledge that you're sort of keeping a bit separate from your response, at bay.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, because skepticism does that, right? Like it encounters, like let's say it encounters a chunk of knowledge. It likes that chunk of knowledge, but then it puts up skepticism in order to rob that chunk of knowledge of authority.
Thank you. Great. So I'm going to now go from I'm just going to make a little list here. Jennifer Scapitone, and then Alan Golding, and then Christopher Chapman, and then Bruce Andrews. So I have to remember 4 people. But let's start with Jen. Do you want me to read your thing or?
I can say it. I wrote
Lovely.
it, but hi Carla, hi Lyn. I
Hi,
wanted
Jen.
I wanted to ask,
I,
you've disappeared from the mic.
sorry, I wanted to ask Lynn about the relationship between optimism and skepticism. Like in your kind of intro, you seem to be placing optimism in the past, and skepticism is something I know you're working on in the present, but I sense that they're like somehow co-constitutive for you. And this is sort of related to the last question, I think. I mean, it's not about authority, but I wanted to hear more about what drives you towards skepticism and if it's a replacement for optimism or something more optimistic than that. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does. I suppose that there is, yeah, I think they are co-constitutive for me. But skepticism troubles optimism, or it acknowledges that the trouble that makes optimism hard to simply exercise without hesitation. And I actually find skepticism, and have for a long time, although I hadn't named it as skepticism until, the last decade or so, maybe. But as, in fact, an affirmative engagement with things that I encounter, especially ideas, including like materialized ideas, crowds on the street, for example, or crowds at a baseball game, or, all cheering for the same team. Like that makes, there's like a lot of affirmation, and maybe I would cheer for that same team, but then there's skepticism that kicks in and says, oh yeah, don't cheer for a team. But yeah, I think that it is like an affirming act, mode of engagement. Skepticism is. I mean that it's actually my granddaughter, who's also in Cambridge now, in the context of Cambridge, who at one point to me said that skepticism was keeping her free. She was in the foothills of the Himalayas at the time, visiting a Buddhist monastery, and remembering when my generation went to India, it was all sort of gaga over Buddhism, and everybody became an instant Buddhist. So I wondered if that was happening to my granddaughter, and no, it wasn't, not at all. But when she said skepticism keeps me free, I thought, yes. So freedom, presumably that's something to be affirmative about, and probably not optimistic about, although we all have some degree of freedom, at least in our thoughts, that can't be taken away from us. But yeah, that was a rambling, thinking on my feet kind of answer, Jen.
Though.
That
Thank
makes
you.
so much sense. Yeah, thank you.
Ellen Goldine. Alan, are you present?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah,
You're
now you
audible,
are.
too.
I am, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm happy to have you just read the question, Carla, but what I was interested in, and I mean, Barry's kind of said some things that build on it a little bit. I'm interested in historicizing and contextualizing the position, an anti-figurative language position, an anti-metaphorical position. Because Lowell, I mean, since you mentioned Land of Unlikeness, Barry, I mean, Land of Unlikeness and Lord Weary's Castle, despite the title, Unlikeness, are like some of the most manically metaphorical writing of the mid-20th century. And it would not surprise me if for the Harvard graduate, or like not quite graduate, Olson, you know, that context was part of projective verse and anti-simile. And then we get into a whole, you know, kind of domino theory of anti-figurative language. So I would be interested to hear you talk about that, Lyn.
My the sort of seeds of the, I mean, apart from Barry saying I want like to be eliminated from the poetic lexicon, the origins of my thinking about simile comes probably from a political perspective, which is that I am very skeptical about utopian ambitions, which is to say, not like there's a distinction to be made, and Ernst Bloch, among others, has made it. That's, I think, the origin, to my mind, of it, between concrete utopias and realized, quote, realized political, socio-political utopias. And I am dubious that humans can ever create a social system that will last as a benevolent system forever, that humans will always turn it into some kind of tyranny one way or another, or ruin it in other ways. So the only possibility for imagining a utopia that has any credibility to me is one that you can't imagine. That is, to imagine an unimaginable utopia, because as soon as you imagine it, then you can start taking steps to realize it and organize everybody into something,
So
which is
something
really
that
great.
isn't like something.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Was it Bernadette Meyer? Whose phrase is it? The only utopia is in a now.
It sounds like Bernadette.
Does
Sort of things she might say, have
Yeah.
said. Yeah.
It does. So should we go on to Christopher Chapman's question?
I'm game, although I don't think I answered Alan very
Oh, okay, well, keep going then.
well. No, I mean, I'm not sure where to go, but yeah, let's go to Chris.
Yeah.
Well,
you
I'm
can always
interested.
cycle back. We
So
can
one
put a few
follow-up,
things-
Lyn, would be this.
I-
Part of your reading felt to me invested. I mean, I understand this totally because I share the investment. An investment in a certain utopianism in the 1975 to 1980 moment. So now do you look back on that with skepticism retrospectively?
No, I think I still sufficiently remember the thrill of that, you know, both the large utopian moment of the counterculture, you know, Paris, 1968, the Be-ins and the Love-ins in the Bay Area, et cetera. And that the sort of political alliances that were, you know, Maoist, Trotskyite, Marxist, Marxian, all sort of happening at the same time. And I think that was a terrific and a powerful period that I could still remember feeling, you know, I loved it. But looking back on it, like it did not achieve what it thought it was achieving, which just goes to point out my point that, you know, humans just can't pull it off. They try really hard, but they don't pull it off.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you. That was a lovely presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
The question, I want to know why your dad was so interested in Gertrude Stein, and in your imagination, what set him apart in being able to see the positive nature of repetition in the modern novel at the age of 18. I'm astounded, and I'll just come on to the next part to that. I'm asking that question because I'm thinking along similar lines. I wanted to ask you to do a sort of schoolyard exercise around how do you understand a rose is a rose is a rose? Is that a metaphor or not?
Well, I would go with the Bernadette Mayer thing that utopia isn't a noun. The rose,
Yeah,
it's utopian, so not a metaphor, not a simile, exactly not those things.
it's an image. It builds an image.
No, it's a rose.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Yeah, probably. I mean, probably would have, given that it's a construct in language, one would have to concede imagery to it. On the other, yeah, I mean, Gertrude Stein, it was nonsense to say a rose is a rose is a rose, but never before has there been a rose like that in literature.
Right.
So,
Okay.
The rose is read for the first time.
yeah, right.
First time it was ever really been read.
Well, does that make it, the question is a bit loaded. Is it figurative in that sense then, in that it's future looking? Is it allegorical in that classical sense, in that it's a figuration over the future?
Yeah, that's like, I mean, Barry's just written a piece on Gertrude Stein's interest in the historical, well, in being historical, and of course that historical always has a notion of the future inherent in it. The history is future looking. But I would venture that a rose is a rose is a rose is actually fully present. I mean, it's like a rose beginning again and again and again, but as present, not as future.
Okay.
But that's just my reading of that. I mean, it does end up as a literal figure in that it ends up getting written in a circle.
Right. Right. Okay.
Which is a visual sign construed via language. So I think Bruce had his hand up a while ago. Bruce,
Yeah.
are you still here? And do you want to pose
Yes.
a question? Great.
Can I get, am I heard? No,
You're
Yes.
heard.
I'm heard?
Yes.
Okay, four quick things. One, thank you, Lynn, for this presentation, and thank you, Barry, for making it possible to see a generational cohort of mine live and physically present, which is a great treasure for me in these COVID days. That's the first thing. Second, I didn't expect to hear the phrase, I'm teaching, I taught Matthew Arnold today. Just a little quick there. Third, when you were talking about liking and likable, I immediately thought of my current speculation about the sublime and the unlikable as an effect, the discombobulating effect of that, which could then be interpreted as hateful by some people if they can't rise to the second stage of the sublime experience. And then finally, with regard to the word like, I have been just overwhelmed in the last 5 years with my presentation of that word as comma, like, comma, as a generational, which I thought was originally a generational, the defining generational speech defect of our era, which I now has noticed seeping into people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and I'm 74 now, and our era. So when I think of like, I can't think of anything else of it as other than a little time marker, like, comma, like, comma, like.
A like is a
So
like.
anyway,
a like
but
is a like.
mostly just thank you all for being here with this like post generational gray haired contingent of our era. Thanks again.
Well, Bruce, I'm like really grateful to, like, thanks.
And let's see. I'm like trying to catch up with a few other comments. I think Luke Harley has a comment. Luke, are you still here?
He's there. Ask to unmute.
Luke, can you unmute? If not, I can I can read it out.
Oh, he says his kids are
Fantastic.
screaming.
Okay, Duke Ellington used the word bluetopian, a utopian mindset tinged by a bluesy recognition of the impossibility of ever achieving that utopia. Great sentence to throw into this mix.
That's gorgeous.
Yeah.
That's really great. Yeah, I mean, I can't claim the platform from which that was said. But yeah, that's brilliant.
And then John Allen, do you want to ask your question? If you are here?
Yes.
Oh, there you are. I see you.
Asking him to unmute.
Unmute, please, John.
If there's an attack on language, what is the language that's beyond attack? What is an attack on language? I'm just curious. Well,
It's
you
an
mentioned it was an
attack on
attack
language,
at
like-
some point, so I'm just trying to like put that in context. What is language that is beyond attack? What is not? That kind of thing. Sounds like kind of a postmodern, metamodern question, but I mean, I'm just saying, like,
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think my way into that question.
Yeah, you began your question with who or what constitutes an attack on language, or
yes,
what starts it.
what is what is language that is beyond?
And then what is the language beyond attack?
Yeah, Bernadette Meyer used to mention you. Like, she lived around here. She would mention you and another Ray Atronamont.
Armentrout.
Armentrout. Okay, yeah, I always get that wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, West Coast women. You know, I can't imagine a language that's beyond attack. That is a real language. I could imagine a kind of like a Mallarmean equivalent of like Mallarmé's notion of the book, the unrealizable text. So I sort of an unspeakable, unutterable, unlanguageable language would be beyond attack, maybe, as some kind of transcendent idea that doesn't have material shape or ever enters history as something that's present in time, or in the time that humans
Like
are able to think about.
Yeah, that'd be.
Otherwise, I think, anything that gets said is vulnerable to attack. No matter how, unless it's forgotten, all of the lost fragments of the pre-Socratics. I guess we can't attack Democritus for writing about things that he is said to have written, but we don't have it.
Thank you.
I'm gonna jump and suggest that an interesting paradigm for a language that couldn't be attacked would be Khlebnikov's notion of Proto-Indo-European, some kind of language that all languages descend from. And then imagine that, in fact, he's writing this during the Russian Civil War, where attacking is a very real thing and where languages are under attack. And so he's coming up with this notion of a kind of, universal language, precisely to get out of the attack, the way that languages attack each other. You could also think of Esperanto at that time as a kind of League of Nations is not really a good idea because it's just going to be more wars. But if we had a universal language, then we wouldn't have wars. So something of, the spirit inform, some kind of universal spirit, let's say, is unattackable. But then you could also say that universalism is precisely motivated by fear of attack or as a defensive gesture,
Esperanto was what came to mind because I saw William Shatner where he speaks Esperanto, and that stuck in my mind. It was like, oh, that's a universal language.
Yeah.
Perfect.
There were, I think, in the 1500s, there was some writings. I can't remember somebody Warburton, who wrote a text saying that nature's writing, and there's sort of aspects of Emerson, of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it follows up on this also, but that like the squiggles that worms make in bark of trees, or that mildew can make on leaves, etc., that this is actually legible language that speaks beyond any human society's language, but is the language, the true natural language.
That's cool.
And that to learn to read it would then bring people into harmony.
Or like Novalis.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Flowering ideal.
Yeah.
So Ian Probstein has a kind of marvelous statement question. I don't know, Ian, do you want to read it? Are you still here? I'm looking for you.
He's here.
Okay.
History teaches as history teaches quite a different meaning than a rose is a rose is a rose. So it's a statement that either history doesn't teach or we don't understand it. Sounds quite content.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So in the chat, just in case some of Ian's words might have dropped away for some people, history teaches that history teaches that history teaches has a deep contemporary meaning, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, as soon as you raise this, Ian, I'm thinking about the history that's going on in between Russia and Ukraine, and yeah, it doesn't seem like anything was learned from history about war, invasion.
Have a little bit different even memories, because you mentioned 1968 was the date when square against the occupation.
Ian, get close to your mic.
Yeah, it's hard to hear. I'm having a hard time hearing you.
I will use, because something is wrong with my mic here. I will use the headphones.
What good would it?
Maybe this is better, right?
Oh, much better. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, thinking about this phrase in connection with those events that you mentioned, 1968, for instance, when 8 people went out to Red Square protesting against the occupation of Czechoslovakia. I was 15 at the time, and all of them were placed in psychiatric institutions, like prisons, much worse than St. Elizabeth for as a pound. And yesterday, that the 7th of them at 92 died in Israel. Of course, they were exiled later on in 5 to 10 years ago, 5 to 10 years after, and some time ago, Natalia Gorbanevska, who was a prominent figure, also poet and translator and writer, died, and now only one is still alive of those people. And history, and now we have what you we are all following this Ukraine. It's a complete disaster to the consciousness of the Russian nation in the first hand, because Ukrainians are united. They experience a lot of pressure and a lot of atrocities, and but they are united, and they are very positive. And what I sense right now in the sector that I'm following, like several thousand people, they're either in despair or they're a couple of former friends with whom I am friended that are supportive of it. But in light of that, I just remembered another citation from Gerstein about history that teaches or doesn't teach. I don't know. That is a dubious thing that probably history teaches, but we don't learn, or something like that. How do you understand this?
I would agree with you. Just history teaches and we don't learn. Einstein's comment could be taken as pretty ironic, that the only thing that history teaches is that history teaches. Otherwise, it doesn't teach anything beyond that.
So maybe this is a good time to wrap it up with that wonderful citation and bringing things into the present, which Lyn did at the beginning of her presentation. Is there one more question? Okay, Tom has a question.
I'm sorry, actually, I shouldn't be speaking again. I've spoken, but and I don't really have a question. I have a couple of comments, and the first is that on the critique of metaphor, it's hard. We should really remember the relationship intellectually for all of us between the work we were doing and the work of on metaphor and the metaphorical basis of language done by our very good friend. And also that, and after all,
George is
George
present.
Lakoff.
Yes,
George
George
Lakoff.
Lakoff is the
Yeah,
person
yes,
to
George
whom Tom is referring.
yes, that's right, George. Yes, I'm sorry. I just assumed I didn't have to mention his name. George, yes, George's work. And also, I remember being struck by a telephone pole is an edited tree in an early work of Barrett's, and that's metaphor. And finally, those years when we were being where there are two social facts in the mid to the late 70s, where we were being attacked and our work was being attacked, and it wasn't just our work being attacked, that people were being damaged by it. I got fired, you all remember, which was a blessing actually, but so that wasn't part of it. But
it was at the time.
yeah, yes, but it was part of it. And but that in fact, that period was not the period that Lyn is remembering of the counterculture and the hopes for utopia. It was the period of stagflation and the sort of slow beginning of the disassembling of the quote unquote American dream. That is to say, the definition of an American society, which led up to very quickly to the election of Ronald Reagan. So that was actually quite a difficult time. And I would say not the assertion of utopia in our work was marked by the difficulty of what we felt we were opposing. That makes sense? I don't know. Anyway, just
Yeah, well, I would
It
say
makes absolute sense to me.
the opposition was utopian.
yeah, it had to be almost.
But you couldn't live without skepticism.
Well, and skepticism is not a matter. Skepticism is a doubt about objective reality, and that is right, which translates into a doubt about the meaning of the oppressive and leading ideology. So yeah, it's all the same. It is in the same space.
Isn't skepticism a doubt about representation? I mean, isn't that primarily what motivated us? And if you wanted to go across the board with skepticism about representation, therefore you had to encounter it in some form that is not taken for granted.
And
Well,
how prescient that was, given the degree to which we have to doubt everything that comes
That's
our
right.
way now.
Yeah,
All of the texts that say someone is, you know, you've just been, your identity has been stolen, or please give us the following information so that your credit card will not be terminated, or you know, all of that.
now I'm getting ones where they say your identity has been given to you, not rather than being stolen. Finally.
Identity collections. Okay, so this was really fantastic.
Yeah, sensational fun.
But I just have to end this with the last word from Kathleen Frumkin, who writes, telephone pole is an edited tree, is a metaphor for editing. And on that note, I think we're going to stop the recording